I encountered these ideas, I would say, first reading a book back in 1982 by a man named Jeffrey Gray, who was influenced by Norbert Wiener and by general cybernetic theory. And he regarded the hippocampus as, at least as part of the central part of the brain involved in contrasting expectation, let's say, the way you expect the world to lay itself out, with the way the world is actually laying itself out, indicating that surprise was what was the prodroma to anxiety, and that anxiety in some sense was an indicator of the magnitude of mismatch between expectation and reality. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about that, because I thought a lot about Gray, and I thought about Gray for like 40 years after reading his book, and also as a consequence of encountering your ideas much later. The cybernetic model of expectation is predicated on the idea that you lay out an expectation on the world, and the expectation is a model, and then you have incoming sensory data, and the sensory data is the world, and that now and then there's a mismatch between the sensory data and the expectation. And then you have to modify either the representation or the action pattern to reduce that mismatch. But then I thought, well, wait a second, there's a weird lack in that formulation that's twofold. Number one, it isn't obvious to me that it's expectation. It seems to me that it's more likely to be desire. And that's a useful transformation of conceptualization, because if you use the word desire rather than the word expectation, you can infer that the models that are being contrasted against the real world are models of motivation rather than cold cognitive computation. And so, for example, if I'm interacting with a woman who I'm romantically interested in, I'm attempting to bring about the realization of my desire, not my expectation. And that's under the pressure, let's say, of the demand for sexual reproduction. And so the motivational state grips the desire. The desire manifests itself as a fantasy, and then the motivation is the minimization of the discrepancy between the actual world and the fantasy. And then, so it's not exactly an expectation because it's more dynamic and alive. And then one more, I hate to hammer you with all of this right at the beginning, but one more issue on that front is the error. Because you could imagine, and I'm interested in how this matches your hierarchical concept. If I make a mistake such that I don't minimize the relationship between what's happening and my fantasy, one of the mistakes I might make is a mistake of perception, not expectation or desire, because I might be seeing the situation wrong. And so it seems to me that it's more realistic to say that what you're doing is minimizing the mismatch between a model of what's happening, not sensory data itself, but a model of the unfolding present, contrasted with a fantasy, and that the mismatch is what indicates surprise or entropy. Now, I know that's a lot of questions to answer at the same time, but that whole set of objections makes up a pattern. Depressed people are sad and frustrated and disappointed. They tend to feel all negative emotions simultaneously in a manner that's paralyzing. You take the problem, I'm suffering, and then you think, well, why are you suffering? And then you can practice encountering the obstacles that are stopping you, and it'll make you braver, and it'll help you deal with your problems.
Despite the fact you introduced a whole bunch of really important concepts there, I think it was nicely introduced and in a coherent way. So I'm just trying to remember all the exciting things you brought to the table. So yeah, Jeffrey Gray, a great thinker, in my memory, sort of famed for understanding latent inhibition and sort of how you use these surprise or these mismatches or these prediction errors. And it's interesting that you speak to his conceptual roots in cybernetics, because there's a very, very close connection between the things that we're talking about and the early formulations of cybernetics by people like Ross Ashby. So there's this good regulator theorem, which I think, if your listeners don't know about, I think they'd like, and I think you would like a lot. It's just the notion, and provable notion, that to control an environment, you have to have a model of that environment to be able to couple with, to engage with the environment. The degrees of freedom of your model have to match those of the kind of environment in which you're operating. So I think there's a deep connection there. The other thing, well, many things you mentioned there, you use the word fantasies a lot, and I think that's quite important, because very often I sell the brain as a fantastic organ, literally, because it is in the game of generating the right kind of fantasies. And these are the fantasies, these are the motivated expectations that drive our behavior. But in noting that, you've also made a big move, and an important move. I know it's a move you want to make in terms of our conversation, but just to contextualize why that is such an important move. You're talking about motivation, how our perception and action are all contextualized by motivation, and what we desire and what we want, and what the preferred outcomes of our acts. That's, I think sort of the crux, and will probably be the focus of much of what we're going to be talking about. But just to say that vanilla predictive processing and vanilla predictive coding does not deal with that. It just deals with sense making. So it's usually in the moment. Right. As soon as you bring decisions and choices and actions to the table, you're immediately in the game now of making inferences about the future that has yet to be observed. So there are no prediction errors. It's just your expected surprise, your expected entropy, or expected free energy, or your expected discrepancies between what you fantasize should happen, or what you prefer to happen, and what you anticipate given your best sense making at the moment. So I think that inactive aspect, that choice, really does profoundly change the game, and takes us from simple sense making into the world of choice and decision making and motivation. So mathematically, the way that I would articulate that as a physicist would be, okay, if we're in the game of minimizing surprise and this mismatch, this discrepancy that you were describing in the moment, then presumably I will now choose the things that I do in order to minimize the expected surprise in the future. And the nice thing about articulating it like that is that the expected surprise, mathematically, is just entropy. So entropy, uncertainty, and I'm using entropy and uncertainty synonymously here, they are the mathematical statement of the surprise I expect when I haven't actually seen the outcome yet. So in many senses, what you can say is that we are motivated to resolve our uncertainty. And that can be sort of, if you like, carved into two ways of minimizing uncertainty. It can either be through choosing those behaviors that resolve uncertainty in the sort of folk psychological sense, watching the news, looking over there to see whether, my fantasies about the cause of that visual flutter in the periphery of my vision was what I thought it was. Was it a bird or a butterfly? But I think there's another side, well, I know there's another side to that, technically an expected information gain, or an epistemic value. And that's, of course, I will avoid putting myself in surprising situations, being very cold physiologically, or being unloved, or being embarrassed, or anything that I would find surprising about myself. I will minimize my expected surprise by avoiding those kinds of things. And I think that's my reading of what you were saying touches exactly on that.